Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? I know we've been doing my deep dive series on obscure records from various labels. I'm going to take a break from that today. I need to figure out how I'm going to approach the next couple episodes because some of those labels are so filled with obscure records. How do you know which ones to pick? I think I found a formula this morning that I'm going to work with, but in the meantime, I'm going to do something today on the great vibraphonists in jazz history. And the vibraphone wasn't a traditional jazz instrument in the early days of jazz, and it just hadn't really been incorporated into the sound of jazz. And any instrument can be a jazz instrument if you play it with the blues, with feeling, with swing, and with improvisation. Anything can be a jazz instrument. Banjo, harp, harmonica, it doesn't matter. You know, accordion, I've heard it all pretty much. But the vibraphone was just waiting to be introduced into jazz. And the first and great player of the vibraphone in jazz was undoubtedly a guy by the name of Lionel Hampton. And Lionel is a virtuoso in the purest essence of that word. He goes back. He was born in 1908 in Louisville, Kentucky. At a young age, his mom packed him up and moved their family down to Mississippi. No, Alabama, I believe it was, Birmingham. But then shortly after, they ended up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and then in Chicago. And then it was only a matter of time before the big lights found him. But in Chicago, he's a member of the Bud Billiken Club, which was essentially a Negro Boy Scouts. Because you couldn't be black and be a Boy Scout. That's the country jazz is brought up in. So this guy sees the South, Birmingham, he sees Louisville, Kentucky, he sees Chicago, he sees white suburban Kenosha. This kid sees a lot. He sees a Boy Scout group he can't be a part of. All the same, he joins the Bud Billiken Club. He's playing with various groups. He goes out to LA. He's in some band. And lo and behold, 1930, Louis Armstrong comes out to LA and hires the band that he's in to play. And up to this point, he'd been largely a drummer, but he was dabbling with the vibraphone. And Armstrong asked him to play vibes on a couple of tracks. And from there, it just takes off. The guy, the great civil rights activist and preserver of the blues and the great black heritage, John Hammond, brought Lionel Hampton to Benny Goodman's attention. And Benny went to go see him, and almost immediately Benny wants to hire Lionel Hampton for his crew. And we're listening to some Benny Goodman right here, and he hires Teddy Wilson on the piano, another black guy, and Lionel Hampton to be in a trio and a quartet group with Gene Krupa. And Krupa, Goodman, Wilson, Hampton are all four virtuosos of the highest degree. And sadly enough, this represents one of the first times that bands were really integrated on stage. Slavery had been abolished for half a century. You know, we'd survived Jim Crow. We're trying to move forward as a nation. And it's not until 1936, 1938, when Goodman, a Jew who knew poverty himself from Chicago, empathized enough with these young African American guys who were so talented that he could not deny them a chair in his group. And of course they played in some of the larger ensembles as well, but the trio quartet stuff that they do is just outstanding. And it was a tradition of the day for most big groups to have smaller groups that would do numbers as well. And they just would leave audience with their jaws dropped. Hampton was just so prolific. Wilson was such a gorgeous curtain of sound. Goodman, Harry James, of course, was around at the same time. Just so much talent. And Goodman was super commercially viable. Being a white guy, white enough anyway, Goodman sold really well. And it brings a lot of attention to Wilson and Hampton. And Lionel Hampton and eventually has enough steam to go out on his own. And Lionel plays with a lot of people over the years. He truly does. Everybody from Benny Goodman to Buddy Rich, Charlie Parker, Charlie Mingus, Quincy Jones. Lionel's playing with everybody. But in the late 40s, early 50s, he starts recording for Clef Norgran. He's recording for the MRC label out of Chicago, which is part of Mercury, as I've told you before. This is a 10-inch, number 26038, the 26,000 series. So it's the 38th release. It probably puts it around 54. And MRC does reissue some of their early 10-inch stuff in the 12-inch format. But it's really Lionel Hampton that brings the vibraphone to the world. And he's just an unparalleled player. This is an early Verve record, 8106. So this is probably recorded in 53, 54, the Lionel Hampton All-Stars. And he has a lot of records on Clef Norgran that Verve issues early in the 8000 series. I only have a few of them. They're not as easy to come by as they once were, and I've been looking for them lately, but I haven't bought nothing lately. Probably 1955, MRC hits us with Crazy Rhythm, 36034, and 36035 Jam Session in Paris. And I think some of this was from the 10-inch I'm playing, but they come back to back. They're probably calling a lot of their early Lionel Hampton recordings and putting it on the 12-inch format. Both these are great albums. Both these are worth finding. And the great thing about Lionel Hampton is you can buy a lot of the jazz royalty for next to nothing. Lionel Hampton's royalty, and today's buyer knows nothing about him. The guy will blow your mind away. He's just fantastic. Here's more Hampton in Paris. He's got just an incredible sense of timing and rhythm. He's very melodic. He's just a virtuoso at any tempo. And he's always comfortable with the blues as well. So again, Lionel, this is 36032. This is some Lionel Hampton on Contemporary Records from 3502. So this is the second release on the 3500 12-inch series for Contemporary. And that means this was almost certainly recorded early 50s. It says this was also recorded in Paris. Awarded the Grand Prix du Disque 1954. So it's probably recorded in 53 in Paris. But he was such a talent scout, 53. He was so talented that labels like Contemporary, like MRC, like Verve jumped at the opportunity to record this guy. Even if it was some live stuff when he was in Europe, they saw him as one of the great talents of the time, and he was, and he should be remembered today. Of course, Columbia in the late 50s signs him, and he makes some vibraphone music for white folks on Columbia. Lionel Hampton Silver Vibes, and make no mistake about it, these are still fantastic virtuosity. You know, probably a little less blues. Probably a little bit more production oversight. Here's another one, Soft Vibes, Soaring Strings. And so a major label like Columbia was going to present black artists to white America with some elegance and some strings and some wear a suit, and we'll try to color your face and makeup to make you light as possible. It's just insane that race shapes everything as much as it does. And I just get disgusted by it sometimes. I'm not gonna lie. I can sit here and pretend that I understand it all, and I got some insights into it, and little of it has anything to do with actual skin color. Most of it's a design by the elite to keep us idiots, us sheep, all in our different pastures. Because God forbid the black sheep, the green sheep, the blue sheep, and the white sheep all stampede at the same time, shepherd ain't gonna be able to stop us. But if we keep the black sheep and the white sheep and the pink sheep and the yellow sheep all separate, all we gotta do is kill a few of them here once in a while, keep the rest of that herd in line, and the other herd will never even mess with them. He continues into the 60s. He records this great album at Impulse label with Clark Terry, Ben Webster, Hank Jones, Milt Jackson, and Ozzie Johnson. Think about that group. The great Clark Terry, the great Ben Webster, the fantastic Hank Jones, Milt Jackson, and Ozzie Johnson. And jazz collectors today would pass this over all day long. And yet it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Hall of Famers. Fuck all your free jazz. Fuck all your obscure bullshit. This is what jazz is. These were the guys who built the foundation. They built the first floor. They built the stairway up to the second floor. This guy played with Parker. He played with everybody. So he's a member of the second floor as well. And just because all you attic living motherfuckers don't ever get down to the basement doesn't mean the basement isn't what your attic stands on. This is the foundation. Guys like this. All the members of that crew. Ben Webster. Put down your honking avant-garde for a minute and listen to some Ben Webster. Hear what the center sounds like. Moving on. The second great voice in the vibraphone. And for me, it's not even a close second. I love this guy a lot because he takes the virtuosity of Lionel Hampton, and he credits Lionel Hampton as the guy he heard that made him want to play the vibraphone. You know, so the lineage is very, very directly linked. Milt Jackson, one of my Detroit boys. Detroit, man. What a birthing ground for jazz royalty. It's just, the list is so impressive of guys that came up in the 50s and 60s that really changed and drove this music. And of course it was all driven by what I mentioned before, Detroit being such an industrial center. There was employment for the African American. They flocked up from the north in the 40s into the 50s during the war, and that employment led to their children coming up in Detroit. There was enough money in the city for there to be music in the schools and secondary education possibilities with music involved. Detroit just houses a renaissance of the African American, and the jazz musicians that come out of it are just part of it. But Milt is part of that wave, along with Kenny Clark and Tommy Flanagan, and just this whole wave of great, Paul Chambers, all these great guys, the Jones brothers. But he's born on January 20th, 1923. He was born in Detroit, like I said. He sets the tremolo on his horn, on his vibraphone, very low vibration-wise. And it's what creates the vibrato. And he sets it at like a 3.3 oscillations per second. And a guy like Hampton sets his at like 10 RPM per second, RPS. So it's a lot of vibrato when my God, I can't say his name right now. Lionel Hampton is playing, but Milt sets it much more minimal in the vibrato sense, and it allows him to be kind of this very soulful and bluesy, and it doesn't sound pretentious. He's just the bluesiest, gutsiest guy on the vibraphone that there is. Dizzy, of course, discovers him and Ken McAuliffe yesterday asked, is Dizzy the greatest trumpet player ever? And that's a tough question to answer. He's certainly in the top 3 or 5, and no one would fault you if you claimed him to be the champion. The problem is, his musical LP output doesn't connect with audiences the same way as Clifford Brown, as Miles Davis, as Lee Morgan, as a lot of the Freddie Hubbard. You know, Gillespie's in kind of that in-between bebop to hard bop era. He's leading some big bands. Dizzy's trying a lot of stuff, but Dizzy, as much as he was a virtuoso and a progenitor of a lot of ideation in jazz, he's also the great teacher and one of the great discoverers of talent. And everybody, it's just insane as I do all these biographies and all these episodes. You play with Dizzy Gillespie, play with Dizzy Gillespie, play with Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy is just, he wants you under his wing long enough to make sure you're ready. You know, and he wants to teach you all the ropes so you can go out and be successful in this game. And he wants to teach you how to be a man as much as a player, and how to handle yourself as a black male in America. Dizzy is just such a role model for jazz players in terms of how to handle yourself as a human being. And I got super mad love for Dizzy Gillespie, I really do. And while I wouldn't put him in my top 2 or 3 players I love personally, he, along with Freddie Hubbard and Clifford Brown, are the 3 guys in jazz that I'll be sitting doing something, all of a sudden I'll be like, and I'll look, I'm like, who was that? And it's literally only the trumpet that does this to me. You know, saxophone players rarely make me go, what was that? Trumpet players, because it's such a difficult instrument to be a virtuoso with this beautiful, clean sound. When a trumpet player does something that blows my mind, whether it's Lee Morgan, Donald Byrd, but especially Hubbard, Dizzy, and Clifford Brown, they raise my eyebrows. So, to me, that's one of the indicators of how much I love a guy. How many times have they made me go, what the fuck did I just hear? And Dizzy will just turn your neck, you know. He's that sick. But he's hired by Dizzy Gillespie, and he works in his groups. And Dizzy, like what we had with Goodman, has a big group going, but he also has a small group within that group. And that small group ended up becoming Milt Jackson, John Lewis, Kenny Clark, and Ray Brown. All 4 royalty, of course. And Ray Brown's eventually replaced by Percy Heath in 1950. But what you have there with Milt, John Lewis, Kenny Clark, and Percy Heath / Ray Brown is the beginnings of the modern jazz quartet. And early on, the MJQ was called the Milt Jackson Quartet. And it becomes the modern jazz quartet almost like 6 months later. But it's the same thing. And Milt and John Lewis have 2 very different ideas. John Lewis wants to arrange and orchestrate and produce and make a record have a feel and Milt wants to play the blues. Milt wants to just fly and sing and make his soul express. I don't want to sit around here and rehearse certain passages 1,000 times. Let's just play the blues. And there's actually a tension that in a musical setting can be super healthy. Coltrane and Miles had it. John and Paul have it in the Beatles. When you have 2 guys that are polar opposites, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, talent-wise, they often can offset each other and complement each other in such interesting ways, and the tension of that polarity creates an energy, a pulsing vibe that you can feel. And MJQ thrives to me on the tension between Milt chafing at the bit to play the blues and John Lewis composing and arranging chamber music with jazz laced through it. And MJQ was a very important part of jazz history. People are kind of divided on the MJQ. This is an early Savoy session. Kenny Clark's still on board here. He's, of course, eventually replaced by Connie Kay. But early Savoy, 12046. This is Concord Modern Jazz Quartet. This is on Prestige. Had a different title initially, cover, And again, it's Connie Kay, Percy Heath, John Lewis, Milt Jackson. Django, another early Prestige session. Kenny Clark's on this one. So it's actually earlier than that earlier one. Oh, I got 2 copies of that for some reason. Modern Jazz Quartet, Milt Jackson Quartet. It's the same group from 2 different sessions. And actually, 52, it's Lewis, Clark, Heath, and Jackson. And then the second side has a bunch of people on it. But he's a big. These guys are a big part of jazz. That's their first Atlantic record, and these are early Atlantic. Jimmy Joffrey joins them here. One Never Knows, No Sun in Venice. He's starting to pick the European tradition and try to lace jazz to a third stream, which is of course something he's a real progenitor of. The Modern Jazz Quartet and Orchestra. And so MJQ is this kind of prim and proper John Lewis with this buck wild Milt Jackson putting some buck in the giddy up. And it's a real interesting debate going on between them. But during the whole time, and MJQ goes into the 70s before Milt leaves and does his own thing, and then they rejoin each other in the 90s. And so they're together off and on for decades. But Milt's doing his own stuff the entire time. This is on Prestige as well. Horace Silver, Percy Heath, and Connie Kay. Probably from 51, maybe 52. This is another Savoy session. And this has Kenny Clark, Percy Heath, Frank Morgan, Frank West, and Walter Benton. The Telefunken Blues. Opus the Jazz. Flutes and Vibes. Piano, bass, and drums. And this is Milt with Hank Jones, Frank West, Eddie Jones, and Kenny Clark. And so there's a lot of really cool Milt stuff on Savoy that's from 53, 54, 55, 56. And I'm really a fan of a lot of it. I think I kind of fell in love with Milt in this period. And Milt loves to play the blues, boy. He'll play blues at tempo, but he's also just as comfortable playing blues in the slow ballad sense. Just churning along. This Blue Note session comes in the same period, probably in 53. Blue Note 1509. It's definitely from 2 different sessions. Monk's on some of this. Kenny Clark's on some of this. Percy Heath, Lou Donaldson's on some of this. This is a great record. One of the first 1500 Blue Notes that had some current stuff on it. So he's still at Savoy. Pianist, vibist, vocalist, meet Milt Jackson. This is number 12061. And Lucky Thompson's on some of this. Wendell Marshall, Henry Coker, who I believe was a trombone player, was Basie. Frank West, Frank Morgan. Walter Benton makes a sighting here. That's interesting. Julius Watkins is on some of this. Blue Mitchell. Great stuff. Probably 54, 55. Most of that was recorded. And by old Milt Jackson. Jacksonville. Another old Savoy. Fantastic stuff. This is Milt Jackson with Lucky Thompson, Hank Jones, Wendell Marshall, and Kenny Clark. And so I think Kenny didn't really want to be boxing by John Lewis and the rigidity of that. But it shows you that Milt and Kenny are still working together for a long time after Kenny leaves the MJQ. This is one of my favorite covers of all time. The Jazz Skyline, Milt Jackson, Hank Jones, Wendell Marshall, Lucky Thompson, Kenny Clark, number 12,070. And most of the early 12,000 stuff, this might actually be from one session here. Probably 1955 this was recorded, maybe 56. What a great album cover. So Milt's just a giant, he really is. He goes to Atlantic shortly after this and he records a long string of pretty successful records. Milt Jackson, Ballads and Blues. Milt Jackson, Plenty Plenty Soul, number 1269, so you're talking 1956, 57. Soul Brothers, Milt Jackson, Ray Charles, probably 57. Milt Jackson, Bags Flutes. It's Frank West and Bobby Jasper playing with Milt. This is Coleman Hawkins playing with Milt Jackson, one of the great Atlantic records of '58. Fantastic stuff. The ballad artistry of Milt Jackson on Atlantic. Another record with Ray Charles, The Soul Meeting. Bags and Train. Here's Milt playing with a young John Coltrane. And Coltrane is like a buck, a bronco that just hasn't been broken yet. And he's just spitting fire. And Milt's saying, slow down, son. This is the blues here. We're going to play the blues, John. Follow my lead. And it's funny watching John come in and how Milt reins him in at times. It's pretty interesting stuff. Milt, vibrations. So he's got a pretty long string in Atlantic. That probably takes him into like 61, 62. He does this record on United Artists with Benny Colson, Art Farmer, Connie Kay, Tommy Flanagan, and Paul Chambers. Then he does some stuff at Impulse in the late 60s. He does some stuff at Impulse in the early 60s, A14. This is Milt Jackson's Statements Quartet. And this is Jazz and Samba, Milt Jackson, number A70, probably 64 or so. So he does a couple of really good records on Impulse. Then he does some stuff at Riverside in the 60s as well. Bags meets Wes, the great Wes Montgomery, the West Coast jazz guitar player. Big Bags, Milt Jackson Orchestra with Tad Damron and Ernie Wilkins, recording in New York. This is Invitation, Milt Jackson Sextet, 446. Probably comes out in 65. This is after Riverside's already deceased. Milt Jackson and Big Brass. Milt Jackson live at the Village Gate. So Riverside puts out some Milt. And so you got a guy by the name of Milt Jackson who's on Verve, Impulse, Riverside, Prestige, Savoy, Blue Note. He really covers almost all the great labels. Here's one of his Verve records, Milt Jackson, the Hip String Quartet. And then he does 3 records on CTI in the 70s. Olinga, 6046. Milt Jackson, Goodbye with Hubert Laws, 6036. And then Sunflower, 6024. And those are beautiful records. And of course, CTI is going to have a very different sound to them than what you hear on early blues Milt Jackson. You know, CTI is going to definitely have an impact on how we play and write this music. But Milt's seriously the guy that if you want to dive into what the vibraphone's about, he's the guy to go with. Next guy we're going to talk about, I'm going to pause this real quick.